Yes, lovely. So now to get started, we've hit 100, which is wonderful. We're at 105 people. Firstly, happy International Women's Day to everybody. And thank you so much for coming on this important and interesting discussion about women working towards a world without slavery. So I think we can just have a look at the panelists now and just close down the introductory slide. Whilst I just introduce our two incredibly distinguished panelists, we have Professor Bela Arora, who is at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Keele University, where she does some very important work training the next generation actually in these topics. She leads the MA on modern slavery, human trafficking and exploitation, and for 20 years has been engaging with government, business and third sector in creating some of the key international instruments that we now have in the field of modern slavery and human trafficking. So it's a huge privilege to have you on the call, Bela. You are a key influencer and shaper of policy as well as shaper of the next generation. Also, let me introduce the fabulous Parosha Chandran, who is a professor in practice in modern slavery law at King's College London. She is renowned human rights barrister, utterly fearless in the courts. And I think what is fantastic is that she uses this very, very frontline expert experience in order to advise at the very highest level on human trafficking, for example, at the UN, but also within Anti-Slavery International, and using her experience in court to shape public policy, her experience of real survivors of human trafficking in order to try and get a more humane environment around modern slavery. Fantastic. So I'm just going to just try and have a bit of a chat, really. I'm going to start with you, Parosha. There must have been a moment for you as a little girl when one morning you woke up and thought, right, this is what I'm going to do with my life. Was there a particular moment or experience that inspired you to devote your life to the elimination of modern slavery?
Thank you, Rosie. Well, thank you, Unseen. Happy International Women's Day to everybody present. Well, I wouldn't say I was a little girl, but I was a law student and I went to study in France at the International Institute of Human Rights in 1993 during the conflict with Bosnia, the war on Bosnia. And Professor Theodore Merin was the world's leading authority on humanitarian law. And he came and spoke to us about how law might be able to help achieve peace in the region through the establishment of a new war crimes tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. That really hit me, this concept that maybe human rights law can actually help achieve justice and protect people. And so I set my path to understand everything I could about human rights law. And that came in very useful a few years later in 1997, when I had practiced as a barrister, just entered practice as a barrister and started using human rights in my UK cases. And then by 2003, I was approached by the Poppy Project, which was the first shelter for trafficked women in England. And they told me that trafficked women had no protections, no rights. They were giving evidence against their traffickers. They were being removed to their home countries after they'd helped obtain convictions, and they were going lost and missing. And this is because they were probably at risk of and had been subject to reprisals, which could have taken the most severe forms, such as even killing. So I decided to try and start changing the way that law was operating in Britain to bring protection to victims. And so the very first case that I won on that was in relation to asylum, to obtain refugee protection for victims of trafficking who are at risk of reprisals or re-trafficking on return. And from then, I then kept seeing gaps and gaps and gaps and gaps and kept bringing them, the cases, and changing the compass point towards a north point of victim protection. And that's what I'm still doing.
Fantastic. And I mean, what's interesting about that is it's obviously a mixture of the heart and the head, right? So you're obviously very emotionally engaged in this, but using an incredibly sort of cerebral technique, the law, for trying to make change. How do you manage the heart and the head?
Well, sometimes the heart overcomes the head. And those are the trickiest moments. And I have had many. You know, at that point, you know, I probably incredibly disappoint people who wanted something at a particular time, and I've kept promising the work and promising it, but I just have a block. And I think that sometimes is quite reasonable in terms of the level of the traumatic cases that I've had to deal with over the last 27 years of practice. You know, sometimes it all just comes back. But the way that I have really processed this is that whenever I'm in those hard moments, I have to take a step back, not consider myself a failure, and then really rationalize that what I remembered and learned early on was that I see myself as the solution. And in that role, I have to distance myself from the trauma that somebody else is experiencing. Otherwise, I can't be effective at what I do.
Yeah, really interesting. I'm just going to turn to Bela now, just to ask you, when was your moment of inspiration for going into this whole field?
Yeah,
were you a little girl? Were you a little girl?
Well, I think the seed was planted at an early stage, and I think we're often informed by our early years. And you know, just as an earlier individual growing up, I was always being sort of taken along with my mum to engage with various social work related activities, community activities that were during my school holidays. And so I always had that kind of outward facing sort of perspective. But then I took a little bit of a pivot because my PhD area was in nuclear arms control. So looking at some of those military areas of security, I did think at that stage that was going to be my area of research going forward. But I think there came a point where I started looking at more of a human security dimensions and looking at the impact of so many areas of insecurity on the individual. And I think that led me into a whole arena that started opening my eyes to actually processes such as grooming and how that can relate across so many areas of society. And so, like most academics, we are eternal students in many ways. We're just constantly horizon scanning to see what are the new areas that we need to make sure that students are engaged with, and by the end of their degree, they're coming out with the most current knowledge. We want to make sure that they're part of the start of a wave, rather than teaching them things that you know, relate to 10, 20 years ago, that might relate more to my original area of research. And I think when we look at human dimensions, some of those case studies started coming onto my radar a little bit more at that stage. And in particular, I can cite the case of Daryl Semester, who is a British individual. He was vulnerable, but he was exploited and held as a modern day slave in the UK, in Newport. At the time, I was working and living in the Cardiff and Newport area. And that case really resonated with me because it was that reality check of what we often don't want to think about. And that's how close things are happening to us. Things are happening that are close to our point of origin. And I think for me, I was thinking 20 miles down the road, and this individual was being held and had been there for 13 years, not handcuffed, not chained, but controlled through emotional and physical means. He was living in a barn, essentially on a farm, for 13 years, working 16-hour days and being fed scraps. And when that case came onto my horizon, in a sense, that was brought to my attention via people I was working with in Wales from policing backgrounds and Welsh government backgrounds, that really changed the direction of travel for me. Because I think as soon as you encounter that first case that's close to home, it makes you realise that standing by and being a bystander is just not an option. And so in many ways, that point of inspiration for me was from a survivor story, to think, actually, you know, the individuals that are survivors are the lucky ones. but just think about all of those who just don't make it through those moments of exploitation. So that has really inspired me to be more proactive in my work and making sure that I embed it into the curriculum and make sure that I encourage my students not to engage with this just as an academic area of study, but to think of it as being, what are you going to do to contribute to the anti-slavery landscape? What can we do? Because everyone can do something.
Absolutely. And those are inspiring words. So how do you manage between the practical and the teaching? How do you feed your practice with new and inspiring stories?
Well, I ensure first and foremost that I work with as wide a network in the anti-slavery landscape as possible, and making sure that I'm bringing them into the classroom. The students, they can read about the challenges in journals, in books, well-published case studies, but actually getting people who are working on the front line, bringing them into the classroom, and in some cases bringing the survivor voice into the classroom in a safe, managed way, has been really important. And I think that's been the way that I've been able to ensure that the students feel empowered to make changes. So in case of the MA Modern Slavery that I'm running at Keele, we're working in close partnership with a number of organisations, including Unseen, Hope for Justice, the Sophie Hayes Foundation, and Ride for Freedom, all who bring different levels of expertise and experience into the mix. So they've been integral to the curriculum design, as well as contributing to delivery. And I think that's the way that I often make sure that those links are there, they're present, they're embedded, and not just added on.
Absolutely. No, that's fascinating. So if I was to ask you, what's been your greatest success and what's been your greatest failure, what would you say?
Well, first of all, I'm gonna in a really nerdish academic way unpack the failure bit. Yeah. Because I think in the world we just all have a really unhealthy relationship with failure. And I think they're all learning moments, aren't they, ultimately? We often beat ourselves up when things are going wrong or not to plan, or what we perceive to be, sort of disasters in some case. But even, the likes of Einstein, he often said that failure is success in progress. And I think anytime that things go wrong, actually, it's just one step going forward, not looking backwards. So for me, we all have this roller coaster in our lives of when things work out better than expected. And then those other learning opportunities that we think, okay, I'm going to do something differently next time. And for me, I think one of those key moments has been the development of postgraduate curriculum in this area and making sure that it's been multidisciplinary. We need to get away from the ghettos of our individual disciplines in universities. We often get very wedded to those disciplinary boundaries. But I think for me, those successes have been where I've been able to create curriculum content that draws on expertise from law, from history, from the humanities, from politics, business, because actually, as an agenda, it's not tied to one discipline. It really requires a completely 360 perspective that can help us move forward more constructively. So those curriculum developments have really been the achievements for me.
Fantastic, very good. And I love this multidisciplinary approach because we need every single tool in the box for this one. Over to you, Parosha. In a court of law, so success and failure is slightly more binary, right? How would you answer that question about your successes, your failures, and what they all add up to mean?
Well, my experience of failure in the court is very real because most of my cases that have succeeded have taken different appeal routes to succeed. And so it's part of the privilege and the condition of being a lawyer that we have to accept defeat But defeat is only at one stage. So my ethos has always been to equip myself with my best knowledge and my technical skills, and then to see holes in the wallpaper and then try and plug those. That wallpaper is where human rights lie, and the holes are where there are gaps in protection. So I bring cases that may fail at the domestic court level, but I've prepared them with all of my vigor and drive and expertise. And so if they do fail, I can then very confidently continue to appeal them. So the two cases I'll give as an example. So one was a case which involved a young trafficked girl called M. She was in Uganda. She had been, her mother had died. She was left in the hands of a stepfather who was sexually abusing her. She fell pregnant by him. He was then killed by the Lord's Resistance Army, and she had to go and live in a refugee camp in northern Uganda called Kilak. There she was put in the hands of one of the soldiers who were supposed to be protecting the refugees, but in fact, they were sexually abusing them. And she was basically taken by him as his subjugated, woman. She was actually still a girl. He then took her to Kampala, promised that he would marry her, but actually she then gave birth to the child, and the child was taken. It was sold by him, and then she was trafficked to England for sexual exploitation. She was eventually rescued, but when she sought international protection in the form of refugee status, that was refused. And I was her barrister in court, and we lost the case. I then had to appeal it twice, and we kept losing. And each time it was more and more of a staggering moment of reality for me that I am not capable of protecting her. But I never gave up. And so eventually, when the last court had made the decision that they were not going to protect her, I lodged the case in Strasbourg. That was in 2008. And it's called the case of M against the UK. And within a few months, the United Kingdom settled the case and granted her international protection. But that was at such a grave cost for M in terms of the heightened risks and fears that she suffered through that process. And yet, ultimately, it achieved justice and protection for her. And another is a case of the Vietnamese child, AN, and UK, which again, was a case where it failed in the Court of Appeal in 2011, and I had to lodge it in Strasbourg. The judgment was eventually called VCL and AN against the UK in 2021. Resounding judgment, unanimous judgment, that the UK had failed to protect the human rights of two Vietnamese boys who were trafficked for cannabis cultivation in the UK. And again, justice was achieved, but I had to wait 9 years for that judgment in Strasbourg after I lodged it. So there is a real impact on the lawyer in bringing these cases, because you cannot predict the outcome of cases. But if you have the technical skill, if you have obtained it through knowledge, through research, through your passion, then you have to always be brave enough to bring these hard cases. And so that's really a message that I want to share, that so much can be achieved by having that strength sometimes to just keep going forward and to go walk through the concrete wall. And because at the end of that, the whole point is that we're doing it for somebody else. And there's no one else to do it for that person. But by achieving these outcomes, you help that person, but you can help so many other people. That case of VCL and AN is the global lead case on the protection from punishment for victims of trafficking who commit crimes as a direct consequence of their exploitation. So, yeah.
So what I'm hearing is this is emotion powered by a powerful sense of justice, but
Yeah.
backed up with an awful lot of brain power, seems to
Yeah.
me, and with tremendous determination. I just wanted to turn to a couple of the questions we've had in, actually. We had one question in beforehand, which was, do you think it's possible to eliminate slavery altogether? So that's one question. It's linked to one that's just come in here, which says nearly every organisation I interact with has a policy on modern slavery. Why is there still the level of forced labour in global supply chains, notably the level of child labour? To both of you, will it ever go away? What is this thing? Why does society keep on doing it? I mean, I don't know, Parosha, do you want to pick up with that, with something, relating perhaps to some of the very grim and extreme things that you're exposed to on a daily basis?
What I've appreciated throughout the time that I've been in this field, which is now for over 2 decades, like solidly dealing with modern slavery and human trafficking, is that slavery and trafficking and servitude, forced labour, removal of organs, forced marriage, illegal adoption, sports trafficking, orphanage trafficking, these are all motivated by the greed of human beings. And so there has to be a focus point towards obtaining justice. That is justice for the victims, that they need to see perpetrators put behind bars. They need to to receive justice in terms of their rights recognition at a high level of the harm that they have been subjected to, including compensation, whether that's from the perpetrator or from a compensation fund or from civil proceedings. But then in terms of global supply chains, I think where things have not yet caught up is that we need to have criminal laws to make corporations criminally liable for having slavery, servitude, forced labour, any form of exploitation at that level of modern slavery in their supply chains. We don't. We started with the transparency provisions. We've got other countries around the world looking at how to deal with this better in order to have accountability and deterrence. But until we actually start bringing criminal cases against corporations, which frankly our Modern Slavery Act in England is not fit for purpose on, because it doesn't include the penalties that are needed, which would be substantial fines, closure orders, disqualification of directors, seizure orders. We need a whole new look at how to stop slavery in supply chains by corporations that at the moment is not yet present.
Absolutely. And hopefully the news this week, slightly brighter news from Europe, that the forced labour ban is inching towards coming into place, is part, but only part, of what you're suggesting there. Bela, what do you think? Are we just talking about the nature of humanity and evil? Well, why is it still there?
Yeah, and I think the gold standard would obviously be eradication. But I think when we look at even what could be possible in a sort of short and medium term, is even if we can focus on making our environments, our countries, our nations collectively hostile to modern slavery, that would actually be something that would be a really good sign of progress. And that means all the different actors and agencies can find their own path in terms of what they can do, what their small part is in a bigger picture. Because we need that connected landscape. It's not a one size fits all. But also, we can see that in terms of global supply chains, there is a lot more discussion and debate out there about ethics in the supply chains and procurement. But ultimately, it's often said that if a business thinks it hasn't got exploitation in their supply chain, they're not looking hard enough. And I think there is that element to it, that supply chains of any major organisation are so incredibly vast that it's hard for any company to be 100% sure of its record. And I always think there's a bit of an alarm bell that sort of rings where you see companies and various kinds of businesses of all size saying in such a bold way that they haven't got it, or they've rid their supply chains of exploitation. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in different ways, but it needs to involve peer support as well if we're going to move forward. Businesses need to be exchanging experiences more openly. And I think one of the initiatives that I was involved with the development, which is the United Nations Global Compact, it's the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative, and it has a key strand relating to labour exploitation and labour rights. And there has been a whole strand of work and activity where businesses are coming together to talk about modern slavery specifically. So I think even if we can start getting to a stage where people are actually acknowledging the challenges that they do have, rather than trying to do the equivalent of greenwashing to present a completely different, holier than thou picture, I think that would be a really good step to be moving in the right direction. But I also think that we've still got a lot of work in terms of moving towards those aspirations of becoming hostile environment for modern slavery. In terms of making sure that the landscape between NGOs and the private sector are more connected. I think sometimes we find that there's a lot of institutional defensiveness that tends to seep into practice. But I think in terms of looking the bigger picture, those spaces for exchange, and this is a great space for exchange as well. But we need those other organisations that are thinking that this isn't their area, this isn't in their kind of remit. We need them to be coming to the table as well if we're going to make progress.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of interesting point that sort of lies between what you're both saying here, which is that as companies and other people become more aware of these issues, they also start to get frightened about legal liability, which obviously is then where Parosha's world comes in. Parosha, how do you see those two things playing? Because obviously one of the things we get to see is too many lawyers, forgive me, but too many lawyers around the table saying, don't disclose, don't say, because we might be found to be liable.
I mean, it's got to be a moral obligation by companies in today's world to get things right. And whilst I appreciate how long supply chains might be, that can never be an excuse for a company saying, oh, well, we don't know what's going on. I'm really sorry, but if a company is going to profit from goods or services that they are selling or in some way capitalizing on, they are responsible for any slavery or forced labor in their supply chain. And that's where I think the conversation needs to start moving towards. Unfortunately, when their lawyers sit around a boardroom and the CEO goes, oh, we found something, do we disclose it or not? The transparency in supply chains at sections 54 of the Modern Slavery Act doesn't require them, doesn't insist that they have to disclose it. And the lawyers, if they're asked, oh, are we going to be sued for this? Will look at the Modern Slavery Act and go, well, no, because actually there's no penalty that can come against the company. Yes, individuals who directly traffic are caught up, but not the supply chain of a company that involves many subcontractors. And in fact, I shone light on the weakness of the Modern Slavery Act not applying to subcontractors as soon as the Modern Slavery Act was published. And then the government tried to create some guidance as to how Section 4 is to be used and said, we consider it should cover subcontractors, but in law it doesn't. So we need to really pin down where this country and where other countries want to start affecting the possibility of combating slavery and servitude and forced labour in supply chains. One thing that is very good, very dynamic for anyone who's present and anyone who's interested is that the EU Trafficking Directive 2011 is currently under review and amendment. It is thought possibly by the 10th of April, we will see a new amended version of it, and that will require the liability of legal persons for slavery, servitude, and forced labour, and all forms of exploitation, which actually the EU directive does, but it will require the penalties to start being enforceable, which is going to be something new. And I would hope that that new EU Trafficking Directive Amendment document, when it's published, will have global impact, and that national countries outside of the EU region will also start recognising that they need to start legislating in their domestic laws to start criminalising the conduct of companies, because otherwise they're getting away with it because there's no law that is impactful on them.
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely right. Thank you for that. I just want to kind of shift the discussion ever so slightly on this International Women's Day, just to think about the issue of intersectionality. How does that impact your advocacy, Parosha? So how do gender, race, socioeconomic factors in the context of modern slavery and trafficking, is that having an impact?
Yes, I mean, it really, these things really play out in some of the facts of the cases that I'm involved in, because once these facts then reach the supervision of a justice court, then we can start breaking down how policy needs to impact, how laws need to better protect, and how violations may be observable. So, for example, at the moment, I've got a case in the European Court of Human Rights, which is called BB against Slovakia. I was asked by Slovak lawyers to help them in this case. This engages all of the points you've just made. It involved a girl who was of Roma ethnicity in Slovakia. She was given to an orphanage at birth, and she lived there until she was 19 years old. She has a learning disability, which places her in a highly vulnerable category because the medical reports show what a dependency she has on people who are nice to her. She is in a country where there has been evidence to show that the Roma are a discriminated group, and women are disadvantaged in the workplace. She was recruited by a family to go and live with them because she had nowhere to go after the orphanage, because there was no assistance or support given to help her learn about independent living after that huge period of institutionalization from birth. And she was going to be given a stipend for her to live independently. The family said, oh, come and live with us, give us a stipend, and that can be your board and lodging. She went and lived with them. They forced her to marry a homeless man so that they could obtain the benefits of her and that homeless man living in their property. They then introduced her to a man who said that he would take her to England, where she could live with other girls in a family environment, which she thought would be very nice, because by this time she'd been made homeless by that family in Slovakia, which was a device to create another level of vulnerability for her to agree to going to England. When she came to England, she was put in a brothel. She had to work for over a year in the most deplorable conditions. All of her money went to trafficker. And then she was recognised by the UK police as being a potential victim of trafficking, was repatriated through the IOM's Trafficking Assistance Programme back to Slovakia. The Slovakian police opened an investigation into the trafficker, but decided to change the charge from trafficking to pimping. Why? Because they said she consented to go from Slovakia to England. Now, any of us in the trafficking world knows that consent is rendered irrelevant where any of the means are used. And in this case, it's the most heightened number of factors of vulnerability that were abused. And then coming to partnership, you know, the Slovak charity, Caritas Slovakia, has been the backbone of this case, having come to my attention. They supported the case, challenging the change of charge in Slovakia all the way up with lawyers to this constitutional court, and then it went to Strasbourg. I finished the pleadings. That was done before the end of the year, and now we're waiting for a judgment. But this was, and so to bring all of those points you just raised, this is the kind of case that will enable, should we succeed, the court to shine light on the internationality, the the gender relationship, the ethnic relationship, the vulnerability relationships, the mental health relationships, we can only but hope for a successful outcome that will be some justice, and again start moving that needle point back towards victim protection, global laws, global policies to be effective domestically.
Yeah, and we will all be looking at that case, because obviously if that goes well, as you say, it has enormous ripple effects and must be brought to a lot of people's attention. Twisting that question around to we who are fighting these terrible issues, in what way can we be more inclusive, Bela, as a movement, and considerate of various intersecting identities?
I think one of the starting points for us all is to make sure that we're bringing in those voices of lived experience into our strategies, our approaches. One example that I think is a really powerful one in my view to cite relates to the work of an organisation, small charity called the Sophie Hayes Foundation. And they have, they initially developed what was called the Survivor Network. And the aim was to empower those individuals. And I think it was really interesting because it was a way to bring lived experience into the organisation. But then actually those individuals who had been put in the Survivor Network said that we don't want that label, because actually we don't want to be defined as survivors and defined by what's happened in our past. I mean, we've already moved the language from victim to survivors, but those who have been experiencing exploitation of this nature are saying to us, that's actually not the way that we want our future to be. So they actually changed the network's name at Sophie Hayes Foundation to CREW, which was very much informed by those individuals who were raising awareness about the labels. And so CREW now stands for Creative, Resilient, Empowered Women. And I think there's something there that's really valuable, because that CREW network now informs so much of the work of the Sophie Hayes Foundation, where their focus is very much on how do we support those individuals, help them build independence, financial independence, as well as confidence, to give them the employability skills to prevent them being re-trafficked. But that work that they're doing in terms of working very closely with individuals in the CREW network is part of the fabric of Sophie Hayes Foundation, and a really good model in my view. So making sure that we're not making assumptions about who are the people who have been exploited is a really important part of this. And thinking about how do we make it more inclusive, so that it's not just us doing the academic navel gazing in academia, and people in different other sectors working in sort of collectives, but not necessarily in a way that's connected to the lived experience.
Yeah, and that Sophie Hayes model is an extraordinarily excellent model, and I know it's something in Unseen that we're also looking at, is how we can get better at this sort of thing. Now we're kind of running a little bit short of time, but there are some very good questions coming in here. I absolutely endorse. There's some very positive comments we'd be glad to hear. There's a lovely endorsement about hearing women talk about what they do and the passion and intention that drives them. So I think you are being heard. So a question actually from Nick, which is, how can we get the general public to understand this better? Because already in this call, we've been talking about some fairly specialist things, but we're talking about stuff which is really close to home, that's happening down the road, or is directly related to our iPhone or our carrots or some other product that we use. What can we do? Parosha, hitting the general public.
It's interesting because I think the general public are interested, and the general public are engaged in these issues. You know, there's so much more reporting about forced labour, modern slavery, human trafficking in the media. You know, the cases in England, the Rochdale grooming cases, for example, you know, really kind of garnered like a lot of attention to these issues, you know, like from the angle of internal domestic trafficking. So too the county lines cases, you know, the children were being used, you know, British children, English children, Class A drugs taking up and down the country, moving the awareness away from why and it's necessary to criminalize those children and why it's necessary to protect those children is very important. And so the media is incredibly critical to this understanding. We're lone voices. Yes, my cases, achieve attention, at various levels and can start changing, how people are thinking in various sectors. And I admire Bella's work enormously as well, and yours at Unseen. But I think the media is very, very key. And so The Guardian, with its Modern Slavery Hub and loads of different newspapers that have reported on these things, it'd be wonderful to have that support from journalism, because that's how the public become aware. That's how they start caring. The case of the man who lived in the shed of somebody for 40 years, that was on every single news channel, every single TV show, program, and on, reporting the news and on the headlines. So, but we need to have concerted interest and on much broader issues than some of the
Absolutely.
big cases too.
I'm horrified to see we've only got 2 more minutes to go. I could carry on all morning. I'm sure other people have better things to do, but I think there's looking at the chat, there are many people who would also like to carry on all morning. And great, Bibi, for your comments, and thank you for the work that you do. Finally, just one thing. I'm going to ask that really annoying chair, just one thing question. What is the just one thing that you would say that people on this call can do to move the needle on this? Bella, do you want to go first?
I think for me, if I had to pick one, given that there is a spectrum of interventions that are very different at different parts of that journey, relating to how do we prevent re-exploitation through to some of the bigger global agendas. Now, in my view, I think the reference point where I think we can impact things that relate to the Sustainable Development Goals is actually thinking back to the SDG summit of last year, where there was a deafening silence in the way that modern slavery was treated. Modern slavery is integral to so many areas of the Sustainable Development Goals. And yet we're having that global leadership vacuum, in a sense. There was an opportunity to reinforce their commitment of different states through the negotiations and the declaration, but that just didn't happen. So I think one thing that we can do is make sure that we're putting pressure and lobbying our representatives to make sure that this becomes a priority area. If it becomes a priority area where there's leadership at the global level, we then have a little bit more scope for nations taking this a lot more seriously and, quite frankly, putting their money where their mouth is.
Excellent. Parosha, one thing.
I would say find direction in your drive, find technical skills in whatever field you're in, really, really use them, because we have to always remember what's at stake and who we're fighting for. And we have no option but to do our best and to keep going forward individually and together and making a noise.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think I'd add one other thing, which is just because somebody else hasn't done what they should do doesn't mean that you shouldn't do what you should do. Don't wait for other people. Do what you can. But you two are so inspiring. Thank you so much. Thank you to Unseen for organising this. Thank you to everybody for coming on the call and staying on the call, because normally, as you know, there's a big drop off and really everyone's been hanging on by their fingertips all the way through. It's been tremendous. Happy International Women's Day. And let's all continue thinking, what is it that I can do to make this just a tiny bit better? Many, many, many thanks and farewell.
Thank you so much. Thank you.